half the presidents of the United States and half the first ladies of the United States have been teachers, but they've all been students. And at one time or another, they sat in classrooms like all of us have sat in classrooms, and one day dreamed about what they could become. And life is about making dreams come true. I'm going to now turn the program over to President Lincoln, who's going to talk for a few minutes, and then hopefully take questions from anybody who would like to ask President Lincoln questions. So, Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you. For myself, I was born in a one-room cabin. It was 16 by 18 feet in Kentucky. We had a fireplace, not this nice. And as a young boy, I cut a lot of the wood that went into this fireplace. But this is where I learned to read. And this is where I learned to write. And this is where I learned to do very basic arithmetic. Most people think that presidents have had a great deal of schooling. I wasn't as fortunate as some. I had less than 1 year of formal schooling. Imagine that, kids. Less than 1 year. You've already had more than that in the little time that you've been in grade school and in middle school and high school. 1 year. And that wasn't all at one time. It was 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there. And the reason was that my father did not think education was very important. He thought if you knew the basics, that's all that was necessary. But I had a love of learning, and I wanted to learn as much as I could. When my mother died, when I was 9 years old, and that was a tragic event in my life. But my father married another woman, Sarah Bush, who was a widower, who also had 3 children of her own from her first marriage. And when my father brought her back to our cabin, I was so excited because she brought a box of books. Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, The Life of George Washington, and the Holy Bible. We had never had books in the house before. And with my stepmother's help, I learned to read. Well, that helped me later on when I would become president. I became the 16th president of the United States in 1860. And you all know, I think, that I was the president during the most bloodiest war in our history, the Civil War, where over 600,000 Americans, and you have to remember, they were all Americans, whether they were Confederates or they were Unions, they were all Americans. And during that war, a lot of people sacrificed and had a lot of hardships. You probably know some of that history that you've studied in schools. What I'd like to share with you, though, is a little bit about my family, because many instances, as you students have done pictures of the presidents and the first ladies, many times you remember the presidents, but you forget those first ladies, and you learn very little about their families. I wanted to tell you something about my boys. I had 4 sons. I was married to Mary Todd. We were married in November of 1842. Our first son, Robert, was born the following year, in August of 1843. Robert would be the only child I had who would live to adulthood. And he lived to a good, ripe old age. He lived until he was 82 years old, and he died in 1926. Robert was a businessman. He was also involved in politics. He was a member of the cabinet of 3 different presidents. But the dubious honor that Robert has is that he was involved in 3 presidential assassinations. He wasn't at Ford's Theater the night that I was shot. However, he was at the White House sleeping, and they ran and woke him up. He came down to where they had taken me in the boarding house across the street from Ford's Theater, and he was there at 7:22 on April 15th when I died. He was a good friend of President Garfield. and President Garfield had invited Robert to take a train trip with him. Just as Robert arrived at the train station and was walking up on the platform, President Garfield was assassinated. He was also a good friend of President McKinley, and President McKinley asked Robert to accompany him to the New York World's Fair. President McKinley was standing about an arm's length away from Robert Lincoln when he was also assassinated. So a dubious honor for the first and only son of President Lincoln that would live to adulthood. My second son, Eddie, only lived to be 3 years old. Eddie was born in 1846, and he died early in 1850. Our third son, William, who we affectionately called Willie, Willie was born in 1850, and Willie died when we were in the White House. He died in 1862. Willie died of typhoid fever. In those days, we didn't understand the contamination of water with bacteria. Typhoid was a very common disease and killed thousands. Well, the water from the Potomac was merely piped into the White House, and that's what we used for drinking, bathing, cooking. And when Willie drank the water, that's when he got sick. And my other son, Thomas, who we called Tad, because he was a little guy, so he was like a tadpole, and he was sick with typhoid fever at the same time, but Tad was able to survive. So Willie died when he was 12 years old. Thomas, Tad, who was born in 1853, would outlive me, his father. He would live until 1871, but he would die when he was 18 years of age. He and his mother were returning from Germany, and he got sick during the trip and died. My 4 sons, and only one made it to adulthood. The last living descendant that I had was a gentleman by the name of Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, and he died on Christmas Eve, 1985. There are no more direct descendants of Abraham Lincoln alive today. Since 3 of my sons died before they had children, Robert had 3 children, but 2 never married, and the one daughter did marry, and that is where I had my great-grandson, Robert Todd Lincoln. My wife, Mary Todd, we were in love, very, very, but it was funny. We were almost like a Mutt and Jeff comparison. I was tall and thin, which when I'm standing next to these, I thought I was the tallest president. I was 6'4". Now, Mr. Washington, President Washington, you were 6'3½". You almost made it, but I was still the tallest, and I weighed 180 pounds. So very tall, very thin. Mary Todd, on the other hand, was, let's just say she was short and stout. And so we made an odd couple, but we were in love very, very much. We were married in November of 1842, and we were married in Springfield, Illinois, and that's where we initially had our home while I was practicing law. And then we moved to the White House. Mary was distraught when Willie had died. After my assassination, she was there at Ford's Theater at the time. She also went into a depression after that. Mary Todd would live until 1882 and die at the age of 63. Cause of death? She had a lot of medical problems. She had severe cataracts, which was diminishing her sight. She had diabetes. She had spinal arthritis. But from what we know, she died of a stroke while she was at her sister's home in Springfield.